It is absolutely necessary at the present time that a number of persons should be aware of the position of humanity today as regards spiritual development, and the means to be adopted to prevent our civilization from going to ruin. Speaking now in a purely anthroposophical way, I may say that the forces which draw man down to earth are those spiritual forces known to us as the Ahrimanic, which include all that is thought or carried out materialistically by mankind, everything simply and solely intellectual. These Ahrimanic forces are very strong in our age, and they seek every means to impress the souls of men. They try in every way to lead them astray into materialistic frames of mind, into experiencing the world in a purely intellectual manner. For this reason, there should be a number of persons who know how the evolution of man must proceed in order that it may attain its goal as humanity of the earth. To grasp this, it is necessary that we should glance back a little at the development of humanity. We might look back into still more remote times, but it is not necessary today for us to go beyond the 3rd or 4th millennia before the mystery of Golgotha. We shall trace the development from that time to our own, from a particular point of view. In the ancient time of which I wish to speak first, a civilization was developed in the East, in Africa, which in my book, titled Occult Science, I have called the Old Persian. Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, was the teacher of mankind during this old Persian epoch. He was not the Zarathustra of whom history tells, and who lived at a later date, but a much older teacher of mankind. In those remote ages it was customary for the pupils of a great and significant teacher to retain his name for a long time, and the man known to history as Zarathustra was the last pupil of the great Zarathustra. Zarathustra was initiated in a very special way into the mysteries of existence, and was able to teach the humanity of that epoch as a great initiate, a very remarkable initiate. Through his initiation he knew that in that part of space at which we gaze when we look at the sun, there dwelt a great and mighty cosmic spirit. Where we today, with our ordinary consciousness, see the physical sun, Zarathustra beheld a great cosmic spirit, and this cosmic spirit exercised a spiritual influence upon him. As a result of this, he knew that in the sunshine, in the rays of the sun's light, come the divine spiritual rays of grace, which are able to enkindle the higher man in the human soul and spirit, the higher man whom the ordinary man must strive to reach, and to whom the initiates of old gave no external name, but a name which came to them as a result of their knowledge. Thus the great initiate Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, was called by his pupils the radiant star, by which they meant the radiant divinity which sends the rays of wisdom to the earth. In comparison with all the later initiations, this was of a higher order, for in that spiritual cosmic sun beheld by Zarathustra were contained all the forces which cause stones of the earth to consolidate, which cause the plants to grow forth from their seeds, which bring about the spreading of the different species of animals over the face of the earth, and which cause men to grow and prosper. Everything that took place on the earth was known to the first Zarathustra, the radiant star. He knew all this through his knowledge of the sun as a spiritual being. Then came a later time when it was no longer possible to penetrate thus deeply into the cosmic secrets. This I have called in my occult science the Chaldean Egyptian civilization. Even then people still looked up to the sun, but they no longer saw its radiating force, only the luminous and shining globe, and it was Ra, whose earthly representative was Osiris, who shone down to them in the sun that circled round the earth. Thus, when the initiates of old were no longer able to perceive in complete inner clearness the radiant cosmic God, but only that which came from the primal forces, from the astral forces of the sun, certain secrets were lost. Zarathustra saw a being in the sun. At all times he could see the being there. But the Egyptian and Chaldean initiates only saw the forces of light and the forces of movement which came to the earth from the sun. They already saw something less than a spiritual being. They saw spiritual deeds, but not a spiritual being. And the old Egyptian initiates designated the one who on earth represented those forces of the sun, which we as human beings have within us, as Osiris. When we come to the Greek age, the 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries before the mystery of Golgotha, it was no longer possible to look into the mysteries of the sun. Men could then only see the manifested effects of the sun around the earth. They only saw, in a sense, the working of the sun in the ether, which filled the space around the earth. And this ether outspread round the earth, and which also permeates man, was called by the Greek initiates, not by the people, but by the initiates, by the name of Zeus. Thus there was one stage of development in which the initiates saw a spiritual being in the sun, one in which they saw in the sun only the forces that work from thence, and one in which they could see nothing but the manifested effects of that working in the earth's ether. Now, my dear friends, the doctrine of these three sun aspects, that of Zarathustra, of Osiris, and of Pythagoras and Anaxagoras, was well known to one who drew as near to the initiation teaching as it was possible to do at that time. These three mysteries were known, not as a doctrine, but as a tradition which passed through the mystery schools to Julian the Apostate, who was so filled with awe by this threefold sun mystery that what came to him through Christianity seemed small in comparison. He too learned something of the immeasurable story into which Zarathustra had gazed. He too learned something of that activity of fire, light, and cosmo-chemical forces that had first been perceived in the ancient mysteries, but which came down to him through tradition. And this teaching appeared to him so grand, so mighty, that he could not profess Christianity. He wanted to do something else. He wanted to proclaim to all mankind the ancient mysteries, into which he had been initiated up to a certain grade. On account of this was the dagger sharpened, which was to bring him to a violent death. That dagger was used by one of those personalities who, in those olden times, was of the opinion that it was not permissible to communicate the high teaching of initiation to mankind in general. The dagger was wielded by one who held that ordinary humanity should only hear what was taught externally about the sun at that time. Julian the Apostate proclaimed that the mysteries of the sun were threefold. One was the mystery of the earthly ether, another was the mystery lying behind the heavenly light and warmth and fire and the life forces, and another that of a purely spiritual being. On account of this, he was done away with. And indeed it must be said that at that time, humanity in general was still at a stage of its development when it was by no means ripe for the reception of such mighty truths. We can also observe something else, something of exceptional significance. Much of what was contained in these three doctrines of Zarathustra, of Osiris and Anaxagoras, the spiritual sun, the elementary sun, and Zeus, the sun permeated earth ether, had passed into the external esoteric culture of Greece. It was because so much of that ancient wisdom flowed into the personalities of Plato and Aristotle that we have such lofty philosophy, such wonderful Greek art. But the time had also come when the initiation truths of antiquity were no longer sufficiently protected from profanation. It came about that many of these truths had passed over and were known to certain prominent Romans, and especially to the most eminent Roman emperors and leaders of the Roman people. Augustus still knew how to preserve the initiation wisdom which had come over to him, but this is the reason why it was not possible for Rome to recognize that in Greek art and Greek wisdom was to be found something which, if rightly understood, could lead one back to the ancient wisdom teachings. So it came about that although the external brilliance of Greek civilization passed over to wholly prosaic and semi-barbaric Rome, the Romans were not able to hand in its true form to posterity what had lived in the Greeks. The ancient civilization could not pass on through Rome into the newly arisen Christianity with which was connected the mystery of Golgotha. Such words as these are not spoken in blame or criticism, for all these things are necessary for the development of humanity. We must clearly understand, however, that because Rome did not know how to value initiation, the old initiation truths could not be passed on through Rome to the West, and that we, as people of the ordinary consciousness of modern times, are severed from the holy truths because Rome did not understand them. As a result of this, a person belonging to Rome drove them away, and they had to flee to the East. I am bringing all this back to your minds because it is necessary for an understanding of what I am going to say, that we should cast a fleeting glance at the epoch when the spiritual teachers of old were able to gaze up at the starry heavens and see the threefold mysteries of the sun above them. Nothing of this has remained to posterity, save the triple crown of the Roman popes. The outer symbol has remained, but the inner essence is lost. The new initiation alone can look back to those old times. Through this new initiation, of which anthroposophy has to tell, we can look back once again into those ancient times of man's development, when man hearkened to the sun itself, when striving to learn the secrets of the evolution of humanity. When those who were pupils of the old initiates looked into the universe and spoke of what lived outside the earth as the effects of the sun, of what lived in the sun itself, in the great spiritual being of the sun, as perceived by Zarathustra, they meant fundamentally the same as what later was known as Christ. So that to all intents and purposes, it may be said that the old initiates perceived Christ outside the earth, in the cosmos, and indeed in that part of the cosmos represented by the sun. The essential part of the mystery of Golgotha is not the doctrine of Christ, for that was already possessed by the old initiates. Only they spoke of him as living not on the earth, nor in the forces of the earth, but in the forces of the sun. It is quite incorrect to suppose that the old initiates did not speak of the Christ being. That, too, is one of the truths that have been lost to humanity, that Christ was spoken of before the mystery of Golgotha as a super-earthly being. But this today is actually looked upon as an anti-Christian notion. Now, my dear friends, why should such an idea be considered anti-Christian, seeing that the early church fathers said, quote, "The wise men of old, often described as heathen, are Christians in a more profound sense than we." Close quote. The early church fathers spoke of Christians before the mystery of Golgotha. What came about through the mystery of Golgotha was that the being who till then could not be found on the earth, who could only be found outside it by those initiated into the mysteries of the heavens, was actually incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, dwelt on earth, was crucified and laid in the earth, and was seen in his spiritual body after his resurrection by his initiated disciples. What was accomplished in the mystery of Golgotha was the descent to earth from cosmic heights of the great Son being. And the Christ who descended from spiritual worlds and passed through death, and whose body was laid in the earth, after his death and resurrection, also had initiated pupils. What he taught them is what many ought to know today, so that they may take part in the forces of the further development of humanity. Now, all the old initiates had really been instructed by super-earthly beings. The training of mankind was so prepared in the old mystery schools that the pupils of the mysteries were trained to be able to see outside their bodies. Through this vision, they became acquainted with such beings as the great Sun being, whom Zarathustra knew when he learned to know Christ. But they also learned to know other beings of the different hierarchies. We must think of the initiates as having learned the spiritual language spoken by such a being when he descended to earth, and they used this spiritual language as a means by which people could be taught in olden times. In those days men had divine teachers. Christ himself taught as a divine teacher after his resurrection. He, however, could teach something more, something different from that which the earlier divine teachers taught. They spoke much of the mysteries of birth, but nothing concerning the mysteries of death, for the divine world had not passed through death. In that world from which the old divine teachers descended, there was not a single being who had undergone death. Death was an experience which could only be passed through by human beings on earth. The gods looked down upon men, but they actually knew of death only externally. Christ became acquainted with death on the earth. He was not only made manifest in a human being at certain times as a revelation, as had been the case with the ancient teachers, but he dwelt on earth as human soul, as God in a physical human body. He made acquaintance with death. He really knew death. He passed through it. And he became acquainted with something more besides. If Christ had only gone through all that took place from the John baptism in the Jordan to the crucifixion and the death upon the cross, he could not have spoken of those mysteries of which he spoke to his initiated pupils after his resurrection. They then saw that in the whole wide universe there could be no mysteries hidden from the divine teachers who descend to earth, or from the old initiated teachers, excepting the mysteries of the inner part of the earth. There, they knew, spiritual beings had rule, spiritual beings of a different kind from the gods who had descended to men before the mystery of Golgotha. Of these the Greeks knew, and in their mythology gave them the name of the Titans. But the first of the higher gods to make acquaintance with the interior of the earth, because he was laid in it, was Christ. It is an important point, my dear friends, that Christ made acquaintance on behalf of the higher gods with a domain which they did not know till then. This secret, that even they are evolving, was communicated by Christ to his initiated pupils after his resurrection. This secret Paul experienced in his initiation on the way to Damascus. It was an overwhelming experience for him when he discovered that the force which was formerly found in the sun was now united with the forces of the earth. What then was the reason why Paul, as Saul, persecuted the followers of Christ? It was because, as Saul, he had learned from the old Chaldean initiation that Christ did not live in the earth, but outside in the cosmos, and that those who maintained he lived on the earth must be in error. When Paul received illumination on the road to Damascus, he then realized that he was in error, that he had only believed what had been true at a former time, but what was true formerly had now become different. What formerly lived only in the sun had now descended to earth and lives on in the forces of the earth. Thus, to those who first made the mystery of Golgotha known to mankind, it was not only an earth event, but a cosmic event, one that in the early Christian days was taught in the following way by the actual initiates. These first Christian initiates were so deeply initiated that they knew that Christ, who today appears as a being who passed through the mystery of Golgotha at the beginning of our era, descended from yet loftier heights to the sun. There he was perceived by Zarathustra. His force then passed over into the rays of the sun, and was discovered there by the Egyptian initiates. His force then lived in the environment of the earth. There it was seen by the Greek initiates. Now he was to be seen as a being who himself wandered about among men in an earthly body. Now he is to be seen in his right form as the risen one, he who was within the earth, who has seen the secret of the earth, and who can only gradually allow it to flow into the development of mankind. With an extraordinary warmth of eloquence, in the solitary schools of the early Christian centuries, these esoteric teachings of Christianity made their way over from the East, ever spreading further, but working very secretly. These were esoteric teachings belonging to Christianity. The early church fathers still knew something of them, but on the other hand, they saw the attack of Rome. The clash between the early Christian impulse and anti-spiritual Rome was mightier than anything of which history has any idea. Rome drew, as it were, a mantle of externality over the deepest mysteries of Christianity. No one today has any conception in their ordinary consciousness of the kind of relation between the men of old and the forces of the universe. The man of the 4th and 5th millennia knew that when he ate certain substances, these worked on further in his body, and the forces of the cosmos became manifest in him. What did Zarathustra teach his pupils? He taught them as follows, quote, "When ye eat the fruits of the field, they have been irradiated by the sun, but in the sun dwells the great spiritual being. From the cosmos outside, the force of the great spiritual being passes in its rays into the fruits of the field. Ye eat the fruits of the field, and that which, as substance, is dissolved within you, causes you to be filled with the spiritual forces of the sun. The sun rises within you when you enjoy the fruits of the field. This ye must do at times of special consecration. At such times shall ye consume something prepared from the fruits of the earth. Meditate upon the thought that the sun is within this. Meditate thereon until the bread becomes radiant. Then enjoy it, and be ye aware that the spirit of the sun has drawn into you from out the whole wide universe, and has become living within you." Close quote. Of all this nothing now remains but the outer husk, the external part, the eating of the bread and the sacrifice of the Mass, as there is no more a transubstantiation. Those who propagated this externality, in the sense of what Rome introduced into Christianity, are they who fought most fiercely against the suggestion that man must possess cosmic wisdom in order to understand Christianity. They, however, are those who least understand the teaching of Paul. For Paul saw that the radiance of that force which comes out of the clouds, and which is the force of the sun, was a supersensible being, that it was the Christ, that through the mystery of Golgotha the cosmic Godhead united with the forces of the sun and descended to earth. In the first 3 or 4 centuries of the development of Christianity, a good deal was still known of this actual mystery. The external knowledge of the cosmos was then still so strong that even through the traditions that passed down to a later period, it can no longer be recognized in how highly spiritual a way the event of Golgotha was understood in the first centuries of the Christian era. The time has now come, however, when mankind must recover the spiritual understanding of Christianity which prevailed during the first Christian centuries. Since then, what man has passed through has developed in him a high degree of earthly wisdom, through which he has become a free being. Even the old initiates were not free, for when they desired the deepest impulses, they allowed themselves to be guided by divine beings. Man can only become free through this particularly high form of earthly wisdom. But in the near future, this will, more and more, subject man to the danger of having his soul seized by the anti-divine forces, the anti-Christian forces, which I call the Ahrimanic forces. We possess much science, but it has not yet been permeated by the Christ thought. We talk of our culture, yet no one feels induced to Christianize our natural science. This must be done. Our natural science must be permeated by the Christ idea. Otherwise, all that man has brought out of the cosmos will be lost. In those olden times, men were still receptive. They still received understanding through the cosmic food they enjoyed. But man became more and more estranged from cosmic life. During the later Egyptian Chaldean civilization, the old initiates were still able to speak of the forces coming from the gods, of the forces that penetrated the plants and the stones. That is why it was possible for the science of healing, of medicine, to arise at that time. All that works best comes from those olden times, only people are not aware of it. We must, however, turn back again to those sources. We must have a science of medicine really able to look into the deeper forces of being. The solution will devolve on the modern science of initiation, and anthroposophy wishes nothing better than to give humanity what can now be acquired. My dear friends, it is a fact that since the year 1899, the end of Kali Yuga, the dark age, as the prophets called it, is no more. Around us lies the spiritual world, which can reveal itself, can manifest. We can observe it, and it is our task to listen to its revelations. Anthroposophy desires to draw men's attention to this. It does not concern anthroposophy alone, or even mankind. It is the concern of the whole cosmos. When one communicates the knowledge of the science of initiation in detail, concretely, one must expect that under certain circumstances this or that assertion will be ridiculed. But I began by saying that we need a number of persons who have gained from the science of initiation some few facts concerning the development of humanity. And you may conclude that it is necessary today that we should not simply soar in the clouds without knowledge, but that we should animate it and really penetrate into human life with it. This can only be done if this general knowledge speaks forcefully and in a living way of human life. Let me here relate the following. In one of the monasteries in Italy, at the time of the later Crusades, there lived a young monk. He was an exceptionally gifted man, and was able to enter deeply into what had been handed down from early Christian times, not in written documents, but as tradition, passed from one to another, and was carefully preserved in certain monasteries. In many a solitary hour, the young monk learned much in this way. When he was older, he joined one of the later crusades, and in Palestine, or at any rate in Asia Minor, he fell ill and was tended by a very old monk who had been initiated into the mysteries of Christianity. A deep longing was aroused in the young monk to learn these deeper mysteries, but he died while in the East. Later, he was reborn as a personality in whom lived the forces of his former earth life in a very remarkable way. As I said, it is very easy to ridicule these things, but it is absolutely necessary that such concrete matters should be described from the science of initiation. The day will come when it will be seen that it is just as easy to speak historically of these things gained by spiritual perception as it is to discuss external scientific facts. The personality in question was the one known as Cardinal Newman. If you study his own account of the story of his youth and learning, you will see that in him lived a strong personality belonging to a form of Christianity different from that of those around him. You will see why he wanted to get away from the intellectual force of Christianity, and how he dreamed of another sort of consciousness, such as was possessed by the first disciples of the risen Christ on earth. If you follow up the life of Cardinal Newman further, noting how, at his investiture, he uttered the significant phrase, quote, "There is no salvation for religion except it be through the coming of a new revelation," close quote, you will realize that his search was the result of the strong longing felt in his former earth life. He felt the origin of those spiritual forces of which I have spoken. He sensed that one must acquire a new science of initiation through a special development, and that only thus could a new spiritual revelation come about. As regards his conception of Christianity, he never got beyond a certain traditionalism. But I need not go into the story of his later development. You can read that here in your own language. He tried to find the light above the mists, while he really remained within those mists. A deeper knowledge of his being shows us that the fault was really not his. In this respect, he was a sacrifice to the times in which he lived. For what I have called the Ahrimanic forces worked with extraordinary strength in their attacks on him, taking possession of his thinking power so that it could not freely develop in spirituality. A man who wishes to develop freely at the present time must free his thinking powers from being fettered to his brain. Ahriman gains his greatest successes by shortening the second half of man's life between death and rebirth. The time spent by man between death and rebirth is of a certain duration. It consists, as shown in my mystery plays, of 2 parts. The second half runs its course after what is therein termed, quote, the cosmic midnight, close quote. And that is the time when Ahriman tries, and that is the time which Ahriman tries to shorten. In so doing, with his own thinking power, he lays hold eagerly and with great energy of the human brain. In a sense, he hacks his way into the brain. Ahriman constantly strives to fetter man to earth. That is the method by means of which the Ahrimanic forces are constantly at work on man. That is how they are always trying to bind his thinking powers to the life of earth when the spiritual world is in question. And the result is that people incarnate sometimes 200 years too soon. This must be fought against with the strongest energy. Just at the time when Cardinal Newman was at the helm, notwithstanding his powerful energy, he was not able to free his thinking power sufficiently. Otherwise he would not have spoken of something that must come, but would himself have discovered the way to a new revelation. We must refer to such a personality when we wish to point out what it is that will bring men to a new life, when we wish to speak of spirituality. For this spirituality will, in the manner indicated, once more make the mystery of Golgotha comprehensible to mankind, so that with its whole human significance it may penetrate man and live in his innermost being. I brought forward Cardinal Newman as an example here, for in this tragic personality one can study what is needed. And there is a great deal to be studied in this direction in this country. Hence, too, it should be understood in this country that there is an inner necessity to make the spiritual life, out of which Cardinal Newman was snatched by the Ahrimanic powers, once more comprehensible to mankind, so that this civilization may be saved from destruction. It may be said that insight into such concrete connections, if one recognizes them, will create the ideal to do all one can for the spreading of the spiritual life of mankind, which is the only salvation. Let us, however, be convinced of one thing, and that is that the Ahrimanic forces are very powerful. That to which anthroposophy desires to testify has strong enemies already, enemies inspired by the Ahrimanic powers. These powers will grow stronger and stronger. I particularly wished to tell you today that what is trying to go out into the world as the anthroposophical movement will have increasingly to battle with dreadfully hostile forces. If we realize what it is that the anthroposophical movement desires to do, we must keep our eyes open to observe the dreadful calumnies and attacks of other kinds from enemies who want to prevent it from gaining a footing. No matter how strong these attacks may be, we must face them with a positive and living force of our own. It is necessary that the anthroposophical conception of the world should be made known straightforwardly and clearly, even though it may have to be so represented to the world that many will not believe what is fostered in this movement. I hope that many will enkindle the necessary force within them, so that notwithstanding the misrepresentations and calumnies concerning the anthroposophical movement, which will certainly spread abroad, they may, through their grasp of the positive, go forward in their work of making the need for the spirituality of the world felt. This implies the recognition that it is a necessity for the evolution of mankind. If, my dear friends, we have drawn a little closer together through a mutual understanding of the innermost character of anthroposophy and its significance for our age, this communion for which we have had to wait on account of the circumstances of the times will bring forth fruits which to me would be very beautiful. In this spirit and in the thought of this mutual understanding, we now separate in space, though we remain together in soul.